All right, we see got people rolling in. We are 1 minute past the hour, so we can go ahead and get started. All right. Well, hi everybody. I want to thank everybody for joining us for our webinar today. My name is Brent Sheik, and I'm the VP of Channel here at HH2. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this really great webinar. Today, we will be featuring our great partner, myHRcounsel. And I've actually worked with myHRcounsel for many years now. And not only are they a great partner, but they do provide a really great service, which is HR legal assistance. And they work with many verticals, but construction is one of their main verticals. So they are experts in the construction industry. So with myHRcounsel, you get on-demand legal support for all your everyday HR challenges. You can also ensure that you stay compliant year-round as well. And so today we'll be reviewing the importance of employee handbooks and how myHRcounsel assists construction companies with not only their creation but their upkeep as well. So before we jump in, just a couple of housekeeping notes for everybody. Number one, everybody is currently on mute, just to reduce any background noise that may be going on. Also, if there are any questions, we do have a Q&A section at the end of our webinar today. We do have a Q&A box in your browser that you can ask questions there. We'll be answering all those at the end of the webinar. And also, if there's any outstanding questions left, we'll be sure to reach out to you guys after the webinar to answer all those questions that you had. Also, this webinar is being recorded. So we'll be providing that recording to all the attendees and also the registrants as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Mikel Johnson. Michael is a senior attorney for myHRcounsel. He has over 15 years of experience, not only advising, but representing small to medium-sized businesses. He's also got a deep understanding of labor laws, workplace safety requirements, and also state-specific employment regulations. Put all this together, and it does make Michael a great resource for all construction companies out there and everybody in the vertical. So, Michael, if you're ready, we can go ahead and turn over to you, sir.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Just our quick kind of standard disclaimer. This presentation is for educational purposes only. It's not legal advice. It doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. That's just sort of standard language that we use in any presentation that we do. However, if you're interested in getting a hold of us or finding out more about our services, as Brent mentioned at the end, we'll have some information on a slide for you to facilitate that process. We also kind of want to make sure you can keep up with your day. So we'll go through this information at a fairly decent pace, but we will be able to answer questions as we go through, as noted by Brent as well. So our topic, employee handbooks. What is it? We're going to start with sort of a fundamental issue. There's a lot of maybe information out in the public on what people think an employee handbook is. Maybe there's some conflicting information on what it is, what it isn't, that sort of thing. What we want to do with this presentation is from, again, as Brent mentioned, from our employment law perspective, with the goal of assisting and protecting employers. We want to talk about what our view of what an employee handbook is and what it can do to help you as a business protect yourself. We'll also talk about some other areas that are related to the employee handbook as well, but we just wanted to sort of lay out some of that fundamental information as well. So, okay, the big question, what is an employee handbook? Well, a simple definition would be it's a document of legal policies and expectations. It's something that provides information to employees. And from our perspective, again, we want this document to help you. We want it to focus on employment law related topics. So think of it as a document of legal policies and expectations that relate to employment laws that apply to your business. Another thing that an employee handbook is it's a roadmap for the employer-employee relationship. Within those policies that focus on employment law can help explain the rules and expectations for employees and what they need to do in their employment. But also, it's a useful tool because it talks about obligations that can run both ways. The employees have some obligations, and the employer, your business, also has some obligations. Those are the kinds of things that are shown in an employee handbook. Another thing that's useful with an employee handbook is it serves as evidence that your company has knowledge of and aims to comply with these different employment laws. If you've got an employee handbook that's containing some of the policies we'll discuss here shortly, it shows that you as the employer are aware of what your obligations are. It can also be a very important document in case there's a claim brought by an employee against your company, or a claim brought by, say, a state agency, a federal agency with something related to an employee or employment law. If you've got a well drafted and focused employee handbook, some of those details we'll talk about shortly, it's a great way to help protect your company, because that's going to be the first thing that an opposing party in some sort of claim against you is going to want to look at. They're going to want to see your employee handbook. If you've got a well drafted employee handbook, that's going to help reduce risk for your organization. So, one of the questions we get is, what is maybe a typical structure for an employee handbook? We've got some of the information here, but I'll go through it with a little bit of detail. So, basically, it starts off usually with kind of a welcome section and maybe a little explanation of the handbook. It might have something on the company background, some history, things along those lines. Then it's going to move into the legally mandated rules and requirements for the company. Think of things like an anti-harassment policy, an anti-discrimination policy. Those are going to be sort of the rules and requirements policies that you'll see. There will also be wage and hour information, ideally, in a well drafted employee handbook. So that would mean things like, what is your work week? When are your pay periods? What is your overtime policy? What is your attendance policy? Those are issues that would be included in sort of an overall wage and hour section of an employee handbook. Another important section of a typical employee handbook is your leave policies. So that could mean company provided leave, like vacation, or if you provide PTO. Or it could mean if you operate in a state or a city that has a paid sick leave or paid family leave law, that might have to be included in your employee handbook, but you put that information in that leave policy section. Another thing that was mentioned by Brent in the introduction is you want your employee handbook to reflect the location or locations where your employees are working. So part of the employee handbook is going to talk about broad federal laws, but then you also want to have state supplements included for whatever state or states your business is operating in. Because again, there could be specific leave laws, for example, that need to be included in there, such as things like jury duty, voting leave, things like that. Or there could be specific meal period and rest break laws that need to be included in a state supplement. So you want your handbook to reflect accurately where you're working. Another big question that we get, or an issue that can come up, it's the flip side of what is an employee handbook, and that question, what is not an employee handbook? It's important to have a distinction of what properly is an employee handbook and what properly is not an employee handbook. So we want to again focus on your employee handbook, mainly targeting employment law related policies. So what is not an employee handbook? In other words, what would not be those employment law related policies? Well, an operational policy document that contains things like where to park at the job site, what tool requirements are needed for each position, how to handle customer relations. Things like that are not part of an employee handbook because they tend to increase the length of the document while not focusing really on legal policies. Those are more of operational types of policies. If you get into an adversarial situation where somebody's making a claim against your business and they want to see your employee handbook as an exhibit, if you've got an employee handbook that contains your legal policies but then has all this extra stuff in it, like these pieces of information we discussed here, that's actually going to work against you, because the other side is going to argue, well, nobody could read that long of an employee handbook. Look at all that extra stuff they have in there. There's all those items that don't relate to employment law. That document is way too long. Nobody could read that and understand it. So that's going to help you not have the protection that you need with the document. So if you've got a bunch of operational policies, you'd want to have those actually in a separate operations manual, again, talking about the non-legal stuff, how your business is conducted versus things like the important compliance policies that we mentioned before, such as wage and hour, anti-harassment, things along those lines. Another thing that an employee handbook is not, it is not your comprehensive safety manual. Safety information should be in a completely separate document. Just like you have an operations manual that's separate, you should also have a separate safety manual. That would talk about any industry or company required specific safety policies and procedures. Um, Many business insurers do have safety materials that can be made available to their clients. If you use some of those manuals or materials, as you probably know, that could actually even help potentially reduce some of your premium costs. But again, that is not information that should be included in your employee handbook. Also, if your company works with a safety consultant, they might have information on more in-depth type of safety policies that you could put in a manual. We've touched on this a little bit, but it's definitely worth reinforcing. So why are we talking about an employee handbook? Why is it so important? Again, the idea of a good employee handbook for your business is to help reduce your overall risk. Um, it's going to protect your business if you have a well-drafted and up-to-date employee handbook, because if you've got something that's older, it doesn't comply with current laws, it's got too much stuff in it. If an issue comes up and that handbook comes in as an exhibit, one that's out of date is not going to help you. One that's up to date and well drafted could help show your business is aware of compliance and is working on compliance. You want to help set expectations and rules for your employees. Um, if you've got all of your policies in place relating to legal compliance in your employee handbook, that may help lessen issues. It might help lessen misunderstandings by employees because they've got this document that they can look to for the expectations of them. But it also guides your supervisory and management staff because it makes them aware of what the rules are and what the expectations are for that. It's also a key reference guide for the relationship between a company and its employees. And it allows, again, your employees and your management to access those rules whenever needed. It's something that people can look up, and that could have an overall effect of hopefully reducing claims or misunderstandings. And I want to emphasize this. We mentioned it before, but a well drafted employee handbook can help defend your business if a claim comes up. For example, say you've got a harassment claim that is filed against the company by a current or former employee. If you've got an employee handbook that has an anti-harassment policy, and that anti-harassment policy states that an employee must report any suspected harassment immediately, well, if this employee that's coming forward with a claim later signed off on that employee handbook but then didn't report the claim immediately, you've just created a defense for yourself. You could say in that situation, look, we had a policy, they signed off on it, but they didn't follow it. How are we supposed to know that something bad happened? That's an example of how a well-drafted employee handbook could potentially help your business. Another example could be in the case of if a wage and hour claim was made against a company. If somebody said, "Hey, you made an improper deduction from my paycheck, I'm gonna go to the State Department of Labor and file a wage and hour claim." Well, if you've got an employee handbook section that details wage and hour and when the company can make deductions, that's going to prove evidence that's useful in your favor to show, no, 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 we had it all set out. We understand what our obligations are. This person signed off on it. We were following our rules. So really, it's an overall document to help protect you by showing you knew the rules and the people signed off on the rules within the handbook. A question that we get frequently from clients and prospective clients is, what are some best practices with an employee handbook? Um, let's talk about that. You want to have a document that complies with federal law, but also state law, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation. A one size fits all document that somebody pulls off the internet or maybe uses an AI system to create, that maybe captures federal law. But again, you're going to need to have a document with your employee handbook that covers federal law as well as any state law for the state or states where you operate. We also recommend that the employee handbook be drafted by an attorney. The reason why is because, again, somebody trying to help themselves by going off the internet or using an AI system, they're not going to have that set of eyes from the attorney on it to make sure the document does actually comply. Also, sometimes using a human resources services that disclaims their work, they might give you an employee handbook, but say, we don't stand behind this. If something comes up, you better pick up the phone and call your lawyer to make sure it's accurate. That's another way where you would just be spinning your wheels, as compared to if you get an employee handbook drafted by an attorney, then you're going to have them standing behind you on that document, and they're going to make sure that the document is up to date. And again, that goes especially for capturing the federal law and the state law, for particularly if you're a multi-state employer, you're operating in more than one state, you want to have that attorney looking at those multi-state issues. Another best practice with an employee handbook, you want to have it updated probably at least annually. Laws change all the time. There are federal laws that change. There are state laws that change frequently. If you've got an employee handbook, you'd want that updated probably at least once a year. Another best practice with an employee handbook is to make sure that it's employee friendly. In other words, it's easy to understand, so it's not written with some obscure language that people can't get through, but also you want to have it easy to find, whether that's through an online HRIS system, an employee portal, or if you have paper copies that you distribute to employees, or you have them in like a physical document library at your office, you want to make sure that employees have access to that employee handbook. A very important best practice with employee handbooks is to have an employee acknowledgement. That means that they sign a document that states that they have received the employee handbook, they have looked at it and understand it, and they agree to abide by the employee handbook's terms and conditions. So that's something that should be done when someone is hired. They should sign off on an employee handbook acknowledgement, as well as um, anytime the employee handbook is updated, you want to have them also sign off at that time as well. Another important point to emphasize with the employee handbook acknowledgement is that once you have that signed employee handbook acknowledgement for each employee, whether that be a physical signature on a piece of paper or if it's electronically acknowledged, you then want to make sure that you're storing securely your copies of those signed acknowledgements, because again, if some sort of dispute comes up down the road, that signed acknowledgement is a document that's going to help protect and defend your company against a claim. What are some of the best practices in terms of mistakes to avoid with an employee handbook? We talked about this briefly a couple minutes ago, is you don't want to junk up your employee handbook with too much information. You don't want to dump a bunch of stuff in there, again, about operational policies or in-depth detailed safety information. Those items need to, again, be in separate documents. You want your employee handbook to focus just on the employment law compliance topics. Another common mistake that we see with employee handbooks are where maybe an employer is stepping too far and trying to limit employee speech that's actually protected under the National Labor Relations Act. That's the NLRA. So an employer should not have overly broad policies that restrict employee speech on things like discussing wages or talking with other employees about working conditions. Policies that prohibit those types of protected activities could be a huge mistake in an employee handbook and could cause liability for your business. So those are some of the things to avoid. So what are some of the critical employee handbook policies? Well, let's start with a big one, worker classification. Is the person a regular employee, a full-time employee? Are they a regular part-time employee? Are they variable hour? Are they exempt? Are they non-exempt? That information being explained in the employee handbook is extremely important. Wage and hour information should be included in the employee handbook. So again, that's your pay period. That's your work week. That's your payday. That's your overtime rules, your payroll deduction information. That's another critical policy to include. Attendance is a hugely important policy for an employee handbook. So that means your rules on timekeeping. What are your call-in procedures? When does job abandonment occur? Those are important issues to talk about within an attendance policy. An employee discipline policy is also important because it talks about what steps the employer can take for any performance issues or policy violations that may be occurring with an employee. Another important area to cover in your employee handbook are your leave policies. So again, that could be company provided leave like vacation or PTO, or that could be legally mandated leave depending on which state or states you operate in, such as paid sick leave or paid family leave. Some discussion, one thing to note, um, people have asked us when is a policy required to be in an employee handbook? Well, we got to take a half a step back from that because sometimes there are laws out there in certain states. Think of California, for example, where you have to have a policy in your employee handbook on safe family leave law. However, that only applies if you have an employee handbook. So a state might not mandate that you have an employee handbook. Again, that's just an employee best practice or employer best practice is to have an employee handbook. However, if you do have an employee handbook, then there are some state policies that are mandated to be included. So that's why you want to have your employee handbook drafted by an attorney to make sure those necessary policies are captured. Another question that we sometimes receive is, do we need to have a general policy statement uh, or do we need to have a specific policy statement within certain policies stating that any violation of this policy will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment? So the answer to that question really is both. There is generally within an employee handbook a general overall statement that says, the company can terminate an employee if they violate or could take disciplinary action if they violate the rules of the employee handbook up to and including termination. That's a general kind of catch-all policy, but it's also effective if specific policies contain that language. Again, violation of this policy can lead to discipline up to and including termination of employment. Where we really see that where it's specifically included within the policy, even if the employee handbook has that overall language, would be things along wage and hour violations, violations by an employee of anti-harassment or anti-discrimination rules, um, workplace violence policies, social media policies, company equipment policies, security policies, or making a false workers' compensation claim. Those types of policies often also contain the specific language that if you violate the policy, you will be disciplined up to and including termination. One of the things that we wanted to talk about today were some specific scenarios that a construction employer might run across with an employee, and how is having an employee handbook in place going to be useful to you as the employer if some of these scenarios come up. So we've got a few of them we're going to just look at briefly right now. So let's look at scenario one, the consistently late worker. Raise your hand out there if anybody runs into this one. So Fred has worked for your company for 6 months and his assignments take him to several different work sites. Lately, he's been showing up late and missing time punches. How does your handbook help with the consistently late worker? Well, if you've got an attendance policy, that's going to set the expectations so that employees know what the rules are regarding when they need to be at work. So it's a blanket policy. It's going to apply to every worker and it's going to hold up across all your job sites, even if you have workers in more than one state. Another important policy to consider in the employee handbook that would help you in this scenario would be a timekeeping policy. And that is something that requires each employee to accurately and personally record their time. In other words, they can't do time punches for someone else. They need to have their own time records and keep those time records. How about a second scenario, close call at work? So we've got William, a longtime employee, and he has a near miss while operating some equipment at a job site. After the near miss, the site supervisor notices that William is unsteady on his feet and he's got bloodshot, glassy eyes. William is questioned about his appearance and his demeanor, but he denies impairment. So if you have an employee handbook, what provisions are going to help you in this type of situation? Well, most workplaces, especially in construction, are going to have a drug-free and alcohol-free workplace policy. That might sound obvious, but for the sake of protecting your business, it's important to have something in writing that prohibits people from being under the influence, using, possessing drugs or alcohol at work. Another policy that could help you in this situation would be a testing policy. So, a substance testing policy capturing both alcohol and drugs um, is sometimes required in certain industries or for certain jobs. For example, if there's some sort of government bid that's involved in a job that you might be working on, you may need to have a testing policy in place. And one of the areas of that testing policy that could assist you in this situation would be reasonable suspicion testing. So, as we had talked about, William was unsteady on his feet, bloodshot, glassy eyes. That would give a supervisor reasonable suspicion under a policy to start testing to see if William was impaired or not at the job site. A third scenario that we often get questions on is a time off conflict between more than one employee. So you've got two of your workers, Monica and Ray. They're both strong performers and they both have a lot of vacation time accrued. The company has a project deadline at the end of July, and both are key to the project. Monica requests substantial time off in July for a family trip, and then separately, Ray requests time off for a home renovation project. So, going back to your handbook, what written policies are going to help you as the employer get through this situation? Well, your vacation policy, because that's going to set the process for requesting time off, including how far in advance. A well written vacation policy will also give the company discretion over when time off is granted or denied and include other scenarios in there, such as operational needs, saying, if there's an operational need for somebody, you can't be gone at that time. But your vacation policy is going to give you that framework in place that you're going to be aware of, your managers are going to be aware of, and your employees are going to be aware of because they've received the employee handbook. A fourth scenario deals with overtime issues. So you've got Liam, one of your on-site workers. He often asks to pick up some extra hours, and normally the site supervisor coordinates any extra hours or overtime work that he's going to do. But on two occasions in a recent pay period, Liam worked that extra overtime without talking to the supervisor first. So, can a written policy in your employee handbook help you as the company manage this type of situation? Well, the answer is yes. If you've got an overtime policy, it can state in writing that an employee must get manager approval before working overtime. If the employee doesn't get manager approval ahead of time, then the employee has violated a company policy. Keep in mind, in that type of situation, the employee would still need to be paid for those hours worked, including any overtime. But an overtime policy would give the employee or give the employer the opportunity to have corrective action taken for the employee breaking the rules. Let's talk about a fifth scenario. We just sort of touched on it, but let's get into it a little bit more. Rules violations overall. So think about the situations we were just talking about, the attendance problems, workplace impairment, conflicting time off requests, and overtime violations. So what policy in the employee handbook would help the company when someone has broken a rule? Well, the answer is going to be your employee discipline policy. Um, what we always recommend with an employee discipline policy is to keep it flexible. It works to the disadvantage of an employer if they have a very rigid discipline policy. For example, step one, verbal counseling, step two, write up, step three, written warning with suspension, things like that. That is not an ideal policy for an employer to have because then you've painted yourself into a corner. Every one of those steps has to be followed in the same order for every infraction each time. That does not help you as a business. What you want instead is a flexible employee discipline policy, a policy that would allow the company to either skip or combine steps based on how serious an issue is. Another big thing with the discipline policy is to make sure that it's applied consistently to similarly situated employees when the same type of situation comes up. But again, not having that rigid step by step policy and instead going with the flexible discipline policy, again, combining or skipping steps when needed, that is going to provide the most protection to your business. As mentioned by Brent, we have some time for Q&A if there are any questions.
Nice. Thank you very much, Michael. Really good stuff there, sir. We did have a few questions come in. I know Ann's been going through answering a few of them. So, Ann, thank you so much there. I know one that came up was, let's see, if only legal compliance related to information should be in a handbook, why do some employee handbooks have a dress code policy? Wouldn't that be the same? Wouldn't that be the same like where to park?
I think I can understand where that question is coming from, but as we discussed earlier, the way that the laws have evolved in the last few years, particularly, your dress code policy is actually now an anti-discrimination policy because it's going to have language in there regarding the company not discriminating against people based on protected characteristics, whether that be a hairstyle, whether that be religious headwear, things like that. It does go to legal compliance to have a dress code policy.
Got it. Thank you, sir. This other one's from Julie Jenkins. If the drug and alcohol policy, including in the testing and responsible suspension, is in our safety manual, do you also need to duplicate that language in your employee handbook?
What generally happens with an employee handbook when it's companioned with a more detailed safety manual is that the employee handbook is going to give an overview of testing, of what the general process is. And if there are any state specific rules regarding testing, that's going to be in a state supplement to the employee handbook. But your safety manual is then going to have the more detailed testing processes and any medical review officer involvement. All of that stuff would be in a safety manual.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. Elizabeth Cortez asked, by law, are we required to make all employees aware if a policy was changed?
It would depend on the state that you're operating in and the specific policy, because, for example, if there is certain types of employment condition changes in California, an employer might have to put out a blanket notice to everybody. But generally speaking, instead, it would be a best practice to do an update with an employee handbook if there's a policy change and have everybody sign off on it.
Excellent. Excellent. Another one asks, can you include information regarding health insurance coverage in an employee handbook? We currently cover 100% of our employees' health insurance, but are looking to change our policy.
That's also a very good question. What we do with an employee handbook is we have a general section that says, the company may make benefits available to you. But then separately from that, just like an operations manual would be separate from an employee handbook, or a safety manual would be separate from an employee handbook, the employer should have what's called a summary plan description for any benefits. And that is a legally required document for employers who offer health and welfare benefits. And that is how the employees get more detailed information on specific benefit programs. So again, we would have a summary paragraph in the handbooks that we do talking about employee benefits, but then it would defer to the separate summary plan description.
Awesome. Awesome. Another one just came through. This is Elizabeth. What handbook policy creates the greatest legal exposure when it's missing, outdated, or poorly written?
I would go back to something relating to either wage and hour. If you don't have something discussing an overtime policy in your handbook, that could be an issue. I would also say that in an anti-harassment policy, if you don't have language stating that employees are responsible for reporting harassment, that could create liability for you as well. And then I would also go back to the mistakes that we talked about. If you've got an overly restrictive policy, something like employees are not allowed to discuss their wages with other employees, that would be um, illegal on its face under the National Labor Relations Act.
Awesome. Awesome. Another really good one from Elizabeth. When you conduct handbook audits for construction companies, what are the top three deficiencies you find most often?
I would say for any company, it would be something that's out of date, as we just touched on, like a law has changed. Maybe your state has passed a paid sick leave law and you don't have information in that. Um, just having an employee handbook that focuses on federal law only and doesn't capture the employment laws in your state or states where you're operating, that could be a big problem. And then also failing to have an acknowledgement form where employees have signed off and then the employer has kept copies of those signed acknowledgements.
Excellent. And then here's one. We have remote workers in Mexico, the Philippines, Michigan, and Illinois. Do we need state-specific supplements for each? And it says we do have contracts for national employees, and their company is based in Minnesota.
Sure. With the work that we do, we focus on the laws of the United States. So that means federal US law and then state law. What most employers do when they are working with employees who are overseas is they either use an employee leasing company or they work with a company that can help them establish an entity in that foreign country to make sure that the company is complying with all the employment laws required there for their foreign workforce.
Got it. Perfect. Looks like that might be all the questions, guys. I'll give another 10 seconds or so for everybody to get a last minute in. Awesome. Well, hey, everybody, want to thank everybody for joining us today. One thing that's really great, well, there's many things great about my HR Council, as I said earlier, but if you are interested in the service, my HR Council can actually have an employee handbook. They can work with you on standing that up in 7 to 10 business days. That's incredible. Very, very quick. So really great service among a bunch of other great services that they offer. If there are any questions or if there's interest in MyHR Counsel, please reach out to me, Brent Sheik, brent.sheik@hh2.com. We can get you to the right person and get you guys started. Also, be on the lookout for the recording of the webinar today. If we did miss any questions, please let us know. We'll be sure to reach out and we will get these questions answered for you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.